On this episode, I take you through our CI/CD pipeline, what that is, and why it's great.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Dave Albert. In this show, I talk about technology, building a company as a CTO and co-founder, and have guests to discuss their roles in technology and entrepreneurship.
So first, what is a CI/CD pipeline? Well, CI is continuous integration, which means that as your code is shipped and merged, that it's available for deployment. So like if you are building off feature branches and then merge them into master very regularly, as opposed to long-lived branches that say are in a more waterfall fashion of multi-month long branches of V1, V2, V3, etc. That makes continuous integration. Well, that's not continuous integration. But if you take features that last a few days that are then integrated in as they're merged, I consider that continuous integration. As with anything technical, there's always some political debates, and certain factions find one method more suited to the description or definition for them than others. But I think that's close. The shorter the time between a branch and a code review pull request merge, the better. So I'm a fan of small changes, small commits that are constantly moving forward, as opposed to larger commits and larger branches that take much more time to integrate. See there? Constant integration is easier than massive integrations. So the CD can stand for either continuous delivery or continuous deployment. I guess technically we're doing continuous delivery. Now in our test environment, we're doing continuous deployment. So I'll start at the beginning. We use Bitbucket for our code source repository. One of our developers creates a branch off of master, makes some set of changes based on what our requirements are, then sends that, pushes that to Bitbucket and creates a pull request. The pull request is then reviewed by someone else. That then gets merged into master if it's approved. And then let's start with the API. So the API gets merged. As it gets merged into master, we use Bitbucket pipelines, which are part of Bitbucket. So I guess it's probably what Atlassian's Bamboo used to be. That then builds a Docker container with the API in it. We're still in the process of updating some more of our unit tests to be able to run this way. So at the moment, testing isn't done at this phase, though it should be. If you can at all make that happen, that's probably the one of the best things you can do. We then ship it to our, or push that to our Azure container registry. Excuse me. push it to the Azure Container Registry, then send a webhook to a small Kubernetes pod, which basically is just kind of a small little Python Flask application that I wrote that makes a system call based on just a simple couple of parameters. And then that will run a either Helm or Kubernetes command in the test environment, and then launch our API, our analytics API, or our Slack bot within the test environment. Then Slack bot will send some notification messages to let us know that it's being run. And then after a bit of a delay so that everything can spin up, it lets us know that it's running our, I call them smoke tests. I guess it's integration tests. I don't know. There's a lot of different terms. I suppose I could look it up, but I just prefer smoke tests from Postman. So if you write Postman tests, you can export those as a JSON. And then there's a NPM module called Newman, which will run your Postman tests. So then it runs our suite of Postman tests against the newly deployed test environment, and either that passes or fails. Sometimes it fails even though all the code is good. Timing issues, random strangeness. I don't know. So if it fails, sometimes we just rerun the test a few times. And if it continues to pass, then we think it's acceptable. I've never had a set of tests that pass once that didn't pass most of the time. So I didn't have one that failed 90% of the time and just happened to pass once. That's never happened. So it's almost always some additional Kubernetes pod was not ready at the time, or possibly system load, because our test environment has less system resources than our production environment. Because obviously it has less traffic. So then once the tests have passed, assuming everything is ready and it's not too late in the evening or a Friday, then we'll coordinate to deploy to production, which is just telling our Slack bot to ship to production and the build number. Usually what we try to do is make sure that the topic in the chat ops channel is the current running production build, so that should something go wrong in the middle of a deployment, we can tell it to ship to production the previous version without having to dig through. I myself get a little panicky if production's not working perfectly. I know there are a few people that I've worked with who get very calm when production goes down, but I'm not one of them. I get a little too much adrenaline going. So I prefer to be prepared for a disaster so that it's easier to recover than to, in the heat of the moment, try to figure out what to do. But this has made shipping to production a non-event. I mean, I know we're a smaller startup than some larger organizations can be, and shipping can take days, weeks, and still have issues where they're trying to manually reconfigure or troubleshoot things. So what this has done for us is just made it really nice, both that, well, for all the reasons of test is always available. Nobody has to ask what was deployed to test when. Are we sure we're in the right environment? Because every time there's a merge to master, that's done. It's easy to run a status command to see what the version is in production. It's easy to be sure that test and production match. If something goes wrong during a deployment, it's super simple to roll back. Now, one of the things that I need to spend a little time on soon is ensuring that we have a process for deploying and rolling back in production should the Slack bot not work or Slack not work. Something I knew, but it, fell by the wayside. But it was at a meetup I went to, I was reminded that not having a process for deployment when one of your tools isn't available is not a good idea, because if you don't practice that process, it will be broken. So I definitely need to spend some time soon ensuring that we have a process for doing that and practice it occasionally. So that's been extremely useful. There's no thinking about test, so we never get out of sync. There's no work involved in shipping to production. Shipping to test at all. There's very little work in shipping to production. It took, maybe 5 hours over several days, just as I had time working on it to enable all of that. And it saved me probably an hour every time we've shipped to test. So that was an invaluable amount, investment in time. And for production, it's even more. And the stress of production deployments is zero now. You must spend some time on it. I wish I'd done it the first day. Obviously our infrastructure was different on day one versus now, but knowing I was going to be using Docker containers pretty much from the beginning could have made this so simple. And I definitely recommend it. So then how we do our iOS deployment is somewhat similar. So again, still Bitbucket. In the past, we had been we're still using Bitrise. So when the iOS build gets merged into master, we now tell Bitrise to automatically send it to test flight, to build and send to test flight. We had been doing a build on every creation of a pull request to master. We kind of stopped that lately, but that was because we were having some issues with testing. So not testing, but with, I think it is testing. Yeah, we've had some unit test issues and UI test issues, but I think that might have been because our Fastlane version was out of date. So I need to get back to checking on that. Definitely need more tests in iOS. We do a solid amount of QA, but it would be better to have some more UI testing to avoid a couple of accidents that have happened in the past. So it gets merged into master. Now that triggers a Bitrise run, which then sends the test flight. The way we handle version changes is with a pre-commit hook. So every time you commit in the iOS branch repository, it bumps up the build number. And then when we need to go a major or a minor version, one of us does it manually. We could probably use Fastlane or Bitrise or something in our tool chain to do that for us. But right now it was just easy to create a small little script that's in the repository and then just a little symlink command in the README, and just make sure everybody does that. Of course, that means that we have occasional issues, merge conflicts, but that's actually not the worst thing, because then that requires us to do a merge from master before we finish, and sometimes that can reveal issues that we didn't know were going to happen. So I'm kind of torn on going back to or having Bitrise Fastlane take care of that for us versus doing it ourselves. I don't know. I'd love to hear if anybody's got thoughts on that. So anyway, we had been using tags to trigger the Bitrise job that would ship to test flight, but we decided let's make it every time it merges. And so what we're doing now is every pull request should be shippable. Now, that doesn't mean that we will ship it. Doesn't mean that every version should be perfect, right? So if you've started to build some element of a ongoing project, so like we're in the middle of finishing up our groups for iOS, that's really only available to some people. So the internal people. So it's not usable by the majority of our users, but it's not visible to the majority of our users. So this is what you would call feature flags, right? Though that's not necessarily exactly what this is, but it's the same principle. If you aren't a member of the people who've been assigned access to the groups, you can't see the groups. So, well, that means that we know that the people in this group are able to see, are ready to see things that are not quite mainstream ready. So that means that we never get in a situation, well, we should never get in a situation, things happen, where we're ever having to consider going back to some version, branching off of that and doing a hotfix. There's no need for hotfixes, really. We just roll forward. So whatever the current master branch is, we can branch off of that, make the change, submit it, commit, merge, test in test flight, and then ship that. So that has saved us so much time. Now it does cost you some overhead in some cases, because you need to make sure that if you're developing some long-term element, that you think that through and ensure that there's a way to gate access so that only the people that you want to have access to that have access. But I wish we'd done this from the beginning. It has made our lives so much better as developers. It's made the people who test the application in test flight happier, because it's constantly up to date. They never go, a week, 2 weeks without seeing a new version. So you do have to communicate which versions should be tested and which versions are just ongoing development. So basically we just say, if you want to test stuff, that's fine, but we'll let you know when there's something that needs major review. This also makes sure that we don't have massive amounts to test at the end. It allows us to get our version or to ship basically every week or every other week. Just it depends on what's going on. We usually have bug fixes, so it's nice to get those out every week. Or we have, small incremental changes that you wouldn't normally go through the hassle of creating a release, but when all you have to do is just go into the iTunes Connect or I guess it's called App Connect now, and copy the 2 or 3 fields, fill out your release notes, and then submit it. There's very little reason not to just do that when you've got, even if you've only got a handful of changes for a week, it's still nice to keep it fresh. So get on your CI/CD pipeline. If you're just getting started, it will save you so much time in the long run. It's so much easier to automate very small bits. It's kind of like test-driven development. I'm going to say it's delivery-driven development. So prepare for delivery or deployment-driven development. Yeah, let's call it that. So you prepare for your deployment. That means that those decisions and the things that you'll have to set up to allow that to work, you'll be doing from the beginning as opposed to refactoring. So just like if you write a test before you write code, you have to write the code to be able to test it, as opposed to trying to write a test on code that already exists. So a lot of times you actually have to refactor the code so that it can be testable. So this would ensure that you've got deliverable code, even if it's an empty application. And that's what we did for Android. So Android's in its very early stages, but it already is set up so that every time we have, I have to check what the trigger is, but we can always change the trigger to a deployment. A merge. It's still, we're not quite ready to test much of it yet, but once we get to that stage, then we'll make sure that a merge to master ships it to not Air Hockey. I think it used to be called Air Hockey, the hockey app. So that's it for this episode, but yeah, definitely create a CI/CD pipeline. If anybody's interested in talking about it, let me know. You can email me at podcast@dave-albert.com or on Twitter @Dave_Albert. Thanks.
Until next time, remember, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.